Coming up on Structures, going behind bars to explore one of Toronto's most historically charged prisons, the Old Don Jail. Then we're out on a day pass to take in some of the late 19th century charm and architecture along Annette Street. Welcome to Structures, the show that explores Toronto's history and architecture. I'm William Coulter, and today we're taking a stroll through Toronto's West End to soak up some of the 19th century flavor of Annette Street. But first, we've got our camera lights blazing as we move in to check out the history of life on the inside at one of Toronto's most impressive and intimidating structures, the Old Don Jail. "125 years ago, the busy area of Broadview and Gerrard was mostly farmland. However, one thing that hasn't changed over all those years is the presence of the Don Jail. Before it was completed, the building went through several design changes, and although the Old Don Jail is no longer used as a prison, its history takes us back to a time when we viewed incarceration in a very different way.
The Old Don Jail, the city's fourth prison, was designed by architect William Thomas. Thomas died while the prison was being built, and the structure was later completed by his son, William Tutton Thomas. The Old Don Jail was commissioned by City Council due to the need for a larger prison facility. Jail number 3, on the southeast corner of Berkeley and Front Streets, had become overcrowded, as it was designed to accommodate only 40 inmates. When Thomas originally designed the Old Don Jail, he used the Panopticon plan and modeled it after Pentonville Prison in London, England. The Panopticon concept consists of a central observation area with wings extending from the perimeter. Developed in the late 1700s, this style provided an efficient and functional means of security and surveillance. It allowed watchmen at the center of the building to see what was going on in the wings. Thomas's first design plans for the Don Jail included a simple front facade on the central block, an octagonal watchtower behind it, 2 front wings, and 2 rear wings. The method of incarceration was also an important factor in shaping a 19th century prison. At the time, there were 2 different approaches to rehabilitation, reflected in 2 separate American prisons. The Auburn prison in New York kept inmates in common workrooms during the day. At night, the prisoners were placed in small, windowless cells. Then there was the Eastern Penitentiary at Cherry Hill, near Philadelphia. It was universally considered the model prison of the 19th century. Eastern Penitentiary was designed on the basis of 24-hour solitary confinement. This approach supported the theory that a prisoner could reflect on his or her wrongdoings and, hopefully, not repeat their mistake. Thomas's original plans partly adopted the Eastern Penitentiary style. His designs indicated solitary cells be arranged along the outside walls. Furthermore, convicted felons were to be kept in the rear wings. Their cells were to be back-to-back, surrounded by a corridor for increased security. However, what resulted was quite different than what was originally planned. Financial restraints required Thomas to adjust the design of the jail to include only 2 front wings with a central block. Furthermore, provincial prison inspectors declined Thomas's choice of incarceration style. The inspectors had their local prison in Kingston as their model, and it was based on the Auburn prison, which was seen to have a more humane type of incarceration. In addition, Thomas had to revise his plans so that a double row of cells back-to-back would be located in the center of the wings, with corridors running along the outer walls.
I think that in building this prison, people honestly believed that the architecture affected the prisoner, and in order to restore these people to society, they needed good living conditions. This prison had leading mechanical heating. Compared to most of the other prisons of this time where the cells were on the outside, you had very small windows. Although the individual cells don't have any windows, in those day rooms you have those huge windows. And it was light and aired. It was very much a leading edge facility.
Several years passed between the time Thomas first submitted his designs and the time the Old Don Jail was finally completed in 1864. There were several factors responsible for the delay, including financing, design changes, political wrangling, labor disputes, even a fire that struck the central cell block. By the time the jail was finally completed, the estimated construction cost of $96,000 had almost tripled.
The Old Don Jail's architecture reflects classical Italian and English Renaissance forms. The four-story central block's front facade has Italian Mannerist architectural details of the late 1500s. Vermiculated or worm-like patterned stonework is embodied in the front entrance and its two columns. The iron-studded oak door is crowned by the arched door frame. The upper, more ornate stories have a pediment that rests on rusticated, banded, Tuscan semi-columns and pilasters. Thomas's design is said to have a psychological or symbolic emphasis. Architecture parlante, which can also be described as architecture that is symbolic or representational, was used to inspire awe and fear. For example, the front entrance is purposely huge, and the sculpted keystone of a man's face above it is said to personify time. Architecture parlante is also apparent in the three-story side wings. The wings have stone-framed barred windows in repeated rows, which is said to allude to the endless monotony of time for the inmates. Inside the Don Jail, a three-story rotunda has a double row of detailed cast iron balconies, each supported by brackets shaped like griffins. Clerestory, or church-like windows, are found in the segmented ceiling. At one time, there was a fan-shaped skylight in the rotunda ceiling, but it's since been covered. The office of the governor, as the warden was then called, was adjacent to the main entrance hall. A separate stairway led to his home, originally located right above. The governor and his family lived at the jail until the late 1880s, at which point a new home was built for them, south of the building. The apartment area was then converted into cells, as evidenced by the brick columns. Wallpaper that furnished the governor's apartment still hangs in its original location. The Old Don Jail was designed to hold 300 inmates. The cells were equipped with very little furnishings.
The individual cells, I think, are about 2'11" by 6'11". In that cell, there would simply be an iron cot that would swing down off the wall, a very thin mattress, there'd be your night soil bucket. That would be it.
Some say the prison is haunted. In the 1890s, a blonde female prisoner hung herself in her cell. Legend has it that her spirit continues to taunt staff and visitors. Guards working the graveyard shift claim to have seen her ghost floating in the main rotunda.
The Old Don Jail once attracted crowds to watch public floggings and hangings. Many mornings, people gathered in the rotunda to watch the floggings. And until public hangings were abolished in 1869, they were held in the jail yard. After that, 70 executions were completed indoors after midnight. The scaffolding has since been removed. Ronald Turpin and Arthur Lucas were the last two people to be executed in Canada. Back to back, with their heads covered, both men were hung together at the Don Jail on December 11, 1962. But Turpin and Lucas are not the most famous criminals to have stayed at the prison. Toronto's notorious bank robbers, dubbed the Boyd Gang, stayed at the Don Jail and escaped from the prison twice. Two of the four gang members, Valent Lesso, known as Steve Sucan, and Leonard Jackson, alias Robert Kent, were executed at the jail for killing a police officer. The Old Don Jail was in use for over a century before it saw any major renovations or structural upgrades. A 5-story wing was added to the east side of the Don Jail in 1958, increasing prisoner capacity to approximately 600 people. Even so, by the 1960s and 70s, overcrowding and general deterioration surfaced. The Old Don Jail closed on December 31st, 1977. The Ontario government proposed to demolish the building, but it was spared. The prison was used as a set by the movie and television industry up until the late 1990s. However, since then, it's been vacant and only opened on a couple of occasions. The Old Don Jail was designated a property of historical and architectural significance under the Ontario Heritage Act in July of 2000.
You can still find the Old Don Jail tucked away at 550 Gerrard Street East. It carries with it a fascinating history dating back to even before final construction. And if the walls could talk, which they just might if you believe the ghost stories, you'd learn firsthand about incarceration from a different time. Still to come on Structures, Annette Street in West Toronto Junction.
At first glance, you might think this is one of the homes in the leafy neighborhood of Swansea in Toronto's West End. With its plastered walls and steep-pitched roof, it doesn't look like a fire hall until you turn the corner and see the truck bays. Built in 1930 to house the Swansea Fire Brigade, the hall cost $15,000. It replaced a previous wooden structure with a brick and stucco design carefully chosen to blend in with what was then a thriving independent community. The village of Swansea had just separated from York Township. Originally, the building housed not just the fire brigade, but also the police and all other municipal services. The village treasury was kept in a bank vault in the basement, which still exists today. Not surprisingly, it's the only fire hall in Toronto to have one. The history of organized firefighting in the village goes back to 1919, when the Swansea Volunteer Fire Brigade was founded by the Township of York. Equipped with 3 hand-pulled reels and 1,000 feet of hose, they operated from sheds located around Swansea. The brigade became well known for their success in efficiency competitions against firefighters from other areas. Their greatest triumph came on August 19, 1922, when they defeated all comers at Varsity Stadium and took home the Silver Cup. In 1923, they replaced 2 of the hand-pulled reels with their first motorized fire truck. By the early 1930s, after the building of the new fire hall, the Volunteer Swansea Brigade were so highly rated that their district was granted the same fire insurance rates as the City of Toronto, which maintained a full-time paid department. In 1960, the hall was enlarged by an additional bay in order to accommodate a new combined aerial pumper truck. Even at this time, the firefighters were still all volunteers. The brigade remained a volunteer force until 1967, when the village of Swansea amalgamated with the City of Toronto. The station became Toronto number 16, ending the operations of the second-last volunteer firefighting department in what was then Metropolitan Toronto. Due to the recent amalgamation of city services, the future of the station is uncertain. However, it'll always be a vital part of Swansea community history.
Coming up next, a walk along Annette Street. Deep in the heart of West Toronto Junction is Annette Street. This once narrow road carves a path through a very distinct community. Born in the late 19th century to accommodate the more well-to-do employees of the Canadian Pacific Railway and related industry. Today the road has widened and the community evolved, but evidence of an earlier era is everywhere, steeped in the quaint houses and stylized churches that still dot this historic street.
Winding its way through West Toronto Junction, Annette Street possesses a unique style and character. Though there's no record of the elusive woman Annette for whom the street is named, the street itself and its surrounding neighborhood has a long history. The area was known as the Humber Plains for most of the 19th century. The 2,500 acres were bound by the westernmost part of York Township. Sparsely inhabited by the Crown, clergy, and friends of the Surveyor General, West Toronto Junction and Annette Street did not take shape until the 1880s. That's when the trains rolled in. The Canadian Pacific Railway had built a railway junction named the West Toronto Junction. With the railway and other developments came a need for housing nearby. By 1880, American immigrant and would-be mayor Daniel Webster Clendenin established the subdivision of West Toronto Junction with dreams of civic grandeur.
Annette Street was designed to be the residential and institutional beauty spot of the new town of West Toronto Junction, which was formed in the early 1880s when the Canadian Pacific came through with its junction west of Toronto and also located a rail yards here.
Originally, Annette Street ran from Jane to Runnymede and was extended to Dundas after the formation of West Toronto Junction. Up until the 1940s, the street had 2 lanes. Despite neighborhood opposition, Annette was widened and extended east to Dundas to accommodate the growing number of travelers through the area. Annette Street also has a claim to fame like no other street in the city. In 1921, double-decker buses 1 through 4 ran the Humberside route.
Taking a walk along Annette, you'll notice an eclectic blend of church and house designs. The images and techniques of the late 19th century combined to make an enchanting streetscape.
From the east, you'll notice the 7 attached houses at 56 through to 68. Built in the popular style of the time using soft, orangey red brick and multiple gables, the houses were erected in 1890 to accommodate the housing crisis of the area. At King Street stands the King Street Church of Christ, built in 1890. Like many of the other buildings along Annette, it was designed by architect James A. Ellis. Though the front part of the church is only a couple of years old, the combined round arches and exposed textured masonry gable give it a commanding presence. Check out number 132 and 134 Annette Street. Built by local contractor Peter Ellis in 1892, they're 2 matched Victorian townhouses. One is built with Credit Valley sandstone to accent its arches, while the other is embroidered with a variety of terracotta blocks. Victoria Royce Presbyterian Church, made of copper-colored brick and sandstone, was designed by Knox and Elliott in 1890. Several years later, a large stained glass window was installed on the south facade. Inside, the window allows a burst of color and light into the church while drawing attention to this biblical image. Across the street on the south side is the Annette Street Library. It features orange bricks, large windows, and a variety of classical architectural references. Originally known as the West Toronto Public Library, it was built with a $20,000 grant from the Carnegie Foundation. It's played an integral part in preserving and educating the community for over 100 years. Just next door is the West Toronto Masonic Temple. Originally reinforced by a Greek porch, it's now replaced by a 1927 neoclassical addition. Further west, you'll find St. Cecilia's Roman Catholic Church and Rectory. The church is built in an English Gothic style. Built in 1909, the sharply pointed arches on the narrow openings direct the eye upwards. The entire front of the building works to call attention to the steeple. The rectory was built a few years later in 1915. Here's the first of 2 churches influenced by famed Toronto architect Edmund Burke. The 1888 original is a combined rendition of Burke's plan for a village and a local craftsman edition of a second tower. In 1906, Brother Watts, along with tradesmen in the congregation, expanded and renovated the building, retaining the eastern tower and carefully reusing original bricks. The church was further renovated to incorporate a vestibule in 1920. The result is a church done in the high style, representing the look and feel of 3 generations. Between Clendenin and Evelyn on the south side are 2 of the oldest schools in the junction, Annette Street Public School and St. Cecilia's Roman Catholic School. Both were built in the classical tradition, with a modern recreation center filling in the ravine. Built in 1911, Annette Street Public is the third building to stand on this site. St. Cecilia's was erected in 1914. Flanked by these two schools is the Annette Recreation Center. Originally on this site was a house belonging to merchant Edward Lawson. It was later owned by Senator Campbell, a prominent resident in the area who also owned the local flour mill. The house had a ravine running behind it, and this is where the Ravina Rink was later built.
Another focus of community on early Annette Street was the Ravina Rink, which was a fairly major hockey rink, certainly for West End residents, that was located where Laws Street meets Annette. Today, the Annette Recreation Center between Annette School and St. Cecilia's separate school has been built on the site, and there's a swimming pool, so the focus has changed a little bit, but it's more children now than adults.
One of the most unique stories of Annette Street comes from this house at number 288. Known as the Birches, it's now a condominium complex. It was the 1889 home of Theodore Heinzmann. Who were the Heinzmanns, you might ask? Well, Theodore Heinzmann's business was one of the first industries of the West Toronto Junction. He moved his piano company and his family to the area. As a result, the Heinzmanns were a household name and a prominent family in the neighborhood. Interestingly, this Queen Anne-style mansion was sold in 1920 to the Loretto nuns. It became a convent for the nuns who taught at the St. Cecilia School between 1920 and 1974. Annette Street has always been known as a neighborhood, not just a street. So much so that in 1889, then Principal William Wilson of Annette School bought the land across the street from the school. The house was finally built in 1899. If you look closely, it's a carbon copy of number 372 down the street, designed to invite the light in.
Another highlight of Annette Street is the house at 435 and 437. Early resident Charles Wilson built the simple red and white brick farmhouse in 1884. Back then it was set quite far back from the road, and just 5 years later, in 1889, it was divided in two.
Here, number 462 Annette Street, was the home of Leonard Lawton. He was the son to real estate magnate and former mayor Peter Lawton. He commissioned this 4-square gambrel-roofed and stucco-clad house in 1907. It's considered an architectural fashion statement of the era and remains a delight today. Annette Street's English architectural influence is probably best displayed by this building, the Runnymede. This 2-story Tudor revival was designed by Kaplan and Sprockman for resident Peter Grant in 1928. It's one of the few buildings designed with both commerce and living accommodations in mind. Another fine example of Annette Street housing is number 661. It was the home of York Township Constable Richard Coe. When he subdivided his property in 1889, he used the proceeds to commission this house featuring intricate woodwork, such as the front porch sunburst, a common motif for the time period. Interestingly, though this original section of Annette at the far west end is the oldest part of the street, the structures are the most modern, reflecting the architecture of the early 20th century.
Annette Street started as a no-name street that ran east from Jane to Runnymede. There were just a couple of market gardens on there. And later on, about 10 years later, when it became part of Toronto Junction, the north part stayed with York Township right up until the current amalgamation of the city of Toronto with all the suburbs. Ironically, that part of Annette was also the last part to be built up, mostly in the 1920s. It continued the tradition of churches and institutions, but it was, they're more modern when you get to that point.
Long gone are the days of the railway junction, but few things have changed on Annette Street. It maintains its turn-of-the-century flavor and its role in the neighborhood of West Toronto Junction. If there's a building or neighborhood that you would like to see on Structures, give us a call at 1-800-939-RSVP or You can contact us via the Rogers website at rogerstelevision.com. Historical structures can be powerful storytellers, providing a window into the dreams, challenges, and achievements of past generations. Their stories can be gentle and inspiring, like the ones shared by the homes and churches along Annette Street, or they can echo a darker side of humanity. The Don Jail can attest to that. Either way, though, the journey through Toronto's history and architecture can be quite an odyssey, an adventure I strongly recommend. I'm William Coulter, and I'll see you next time on Structures.